Can I welcome to the stage Tein McDonald for the first keynote. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're so pleased that this conference is working out so very well because it was touch and go there for a while with COVID, and we've got a beautiful balance of people attending in person and online. So, national and international restoration standards, why and how? I've been working since 2012 with SER and SERA on firstly, national standards for Australia for the practice of ecological restoration, and then the parent body, SER. So why? Well, you know, I don't know that I have to explain to you the seriousness of the challenge presented to the world at this point in time, particularly with climate change. Even without climate change, we've got a terrible problem, you know? So fixing climate change alone is not enough. We've got to throw the whole book at society. We've got to change everything, basically, so that we're caretaking the earth. Now, here are two people caretaking the earth, and they're, I wouldn't say typical, but there are many stories like this. This Brazilian couple whose property has been highly degraded and who over the last 20 years have been working tirelessly to achieve what really is a trajectory of recovery. And this is what the standards are about. They're about a process of gradual change and everybody putting their shoulder to the wheel, because this is the usual trajectory and it's happening now, and it will continue to happen unless we change everything, not just the way we manage our conservation reserves. So standards are needed that can bring this whole story together and communicate it to not just restoration practitioners. Yes, restoration practitioners, but we need to set it in a context, a much broader context. Now, with the national and international standards, we've had the first publication was in 2016 and a revision in 2019. National standards, the Australian document, I'll call them, is just going into a 2.2 revision. So we've had minor revisions since the second revision in 2019. So this is the second minor revision, and we're about to launch it over the next month or two in keeping with the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So we'll be doing that with our partners, because the national document, our Australian standards, they have been developed in collaboration with 13 non-government organisations who work in restoration in Australia. So what do they offer? Really, some people say, look, they're not really standards, they're guidelines. But the point is, what we need is a firm benchmark as to what we expect in terms of performance, but they are aspirational standards because they're not compulsory standards. It's not an ISO standard where you say you have to do this like you might in a building standard or something like that, where your beams have got to be a certain dimension, etc. It's not, they're not engineering standards. We're working with natural systems, we're working with people. So these have got to be aspirational. People have got to improve to the best of their capacity on a trajectory of change. So we are clarifying these two things, and we are also establishing standardised underpinning principles, concepts and language. So it just helps us all work together if we're speaking the same language. We've also got some tools there that people are finding very helpful. Now, there were some terrific improvements when the standards were adopted. The framework was adopted at an international level, and I'll show you some of those differences. But one of them is that the social elements were brought more to the fore. So I want to emphasise now that the standards recognise social justice elements as complementary and important to restoration. Mainly our tools relate to ecological recovery and ecological trajectories, but we also have tools in the international standards that help to measure social benefits and changes on that score. And that includes particularly empowerment and flow of benefits to Indigenous communities. So the Australian standards have 6 principles, and these have been extended in the international standards to 8 principles. They've brought the social engagers, stakeholders to the front, but the rest of them are additional, except they've added at the end 2 others, and that is that restoration gains cumulative value when applied at large scales, and we would of course also understand that that is over time. Over time, restoration gains cumulative value. So that little section at the end of the international standards does elaborate on that quite a bit. And also in the national standards, the Australian document did include the concept of restorative continuum. It was articulated much better in the international standards. So that is now an 8th principle, that restoration is part of a continuum of restorative activities. And this is what I want to focus on now. And this brings us back to the point I made at the start of this, which is that it's not just about ecological restoration practice, it's about changing all sorts of practices that relate to the way we interact with our environment. So if you look at the bars at the bottom, they show that ecological restoration is what we refer to as these last 3 sectors in the larger part of the diagram. So the green ones are ecological restoration. So ecological restoration aspires to full recovery, but it's not always practical. And there has to be some softening at the edges to enable people to incorporate improved recovery of native ecosystems within utilised landscapes. So we've got to be open to that. Yes, we have a high standard for people saying this is ecological restoration, and we aspire to high standards for industry where performance is an important outcome. So agencies may, for example, require full recovery for certain developments, yet for community groups, full recovery may not be desirable or applicable. But the restorative continuum includes these other activities as well, and they are, as you can see from the bar at the bottom, rehabilitation, remediation, and reduced impacts. So reducing impacts, part of the restoration continuum. If we can't present to people a concept where it's all united and we can all see ecological recovery as the ultimate outcome, then we're not going to get anywhere. So we have to bring the whole of society into this process. Reducing impacts, if we don't reduce impacts, in my view, we can't achieve ecological restoration anywhere, because climate change as a result of our impacts is actually impacting the very existence of many ecosystems. It doesn't matter how well we restore them or remove other impacts. If we can't reduce climate change, many of these are severely threatened. We're going to lose species anyway, but we do have to make a very big effort. Look, the whole idea about restoration is not about creating a museum piece of the past. There's no point putting band-aids on things. You try and deal with your causes first. So of course we must include reducing societal impacts in the big picture of ecological restoration. Now for the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, they call it, this is more the picture they're pushing, this broader picture. So in between that reducing societal impacts and initiating or partially attaining recovery or fully recovering, in between the green and the dark blue, there are these fields of improving ecosystem management and repairing ecosystem functions. So this is in the utilised landscape that we have to improve our agricultural practices, our other industrial practices, and repair ecosystem function. For example, it might be a sugarcane field. It's still producing ecosystem services. We need to make sure that there are balances. With respect to language, the terms that we're using in the standards, both sets of standards, are those that have been developed by the Society for Ecological Restoration's primer. So the concept of reference ecosystems is fundamental to ecological restoration. We need to identify what we're restoring to, and basically we're restoring to native ecosystems that have some recognisable existence. So yes, these ecosystems may themselves be changing as a result of climate change and normal change. So we need to incorporate that flexibility into our reference ecosystems. Targets, goals and indicators are defined. We tried to make the definitions of all those terms consistent with all the other major guidelines. And approaches to restoration have been very important and a great contribution that we've been able to make to the international story. What we've been trying to say is that, and this is why we have a principle of undertaking restoration that is responsive to the degree of resilience on a site, we need to optimise potential for natural regeneration and assisted natural regeneration before we assume that reconstructing an ecosystem is necessary, because nature does it better than we do most of the time. We've negotiated with people using various terms around the world that actually assisted regeneration might not be the best term, because there's a very prominent method of ecological restoration called assisted natural regeneration, which includes a little bit of enhancement planting because it's applied in third world countries where they need that sort of support. So we've agreed to use the term facilitated regeneration, and we've listed in the standards synonyms that are used in different countries, and people who want to continue to use assisted regeneration in Australia can. So we now, instead of a typology with 3 approaches, we now have a 4th approach, which is combined regeneration reintroduction. So we've got natural regeneration, facilitated regeneration, combined reintroduction and reconstruction. And that pretty well covers the lot. So we think this is going to fly, and our partners are in support of it. In terms of tools, we have a 5-star recovery system, which has this marvellous little wheel that you can colour for the starting point and then progress as your project matures. What that wheel is about is it's about the 6 attributes of ecosystems, and then you have sub-attributes within each of those attributes. You try and report back. This is a reporting tool, a communication tool. You try and report back how you're going over time with each of those sub-attributes within the attributes. And it's great to help you focus your planning, your monitoring and your implementation. And we have found, because quite a lot of people are using this now, that managers and planners are talking to each other now. So with encouragement from the parent body and their partners, we've also included a social benefits wheel in the international standards. So this refers to attributes such as community wellbeing, stakeholder engagement, benefits distribution, knowledge enrichment, restoring natural capital and a sustainable economy. So this is about big picture again. It's about the social ecological landscape, not simply the ecological. And this is an example of it. The Barrapawemba Wetland Restoration Project is one of the projects being represented here at the conference, so you can hear their talk this afternoon. And restoration is a very powerful way of engaging Indigenous communities in helping to repair ecosystems and thereby gain employment and training. And they're also nominees for the awards that will be presented on Thursday afternoon at the plenary session. So I think you'll look forward to that. There were 15 entries and I think 9 finalists. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that, look, we're working with ecosystems. There is a temptation for us to think that we must apply technological fixes all the time, but how good is our technology? We need humility. We're working with ancient species and ecosystems, and we're working in a conservation context where they're the boss, not us. You know, we're learning that just like with people, we need to be humble with ecosystems as well. An excellent speaker yesterday talked about decolonisation, how restoration is like ecological decolonisation, and it is. You know, we're trying to remove the scars of what we've actually done to these ecosystems. So, yeah, we hope that these standards are going to help to get us there. Thank you, everybody. Now, my understanding is that we're now hearing from Kingsley Dixon, who's going to complete this, this particular presentation. So if Michael could get Kingsley on the line.
I'm here.
Welcome, Kingsley.
Welcome. Yeah, well, thank you. And good morning to everybody. A great crowd, missing you all. As Tein reminded me, this is the first SERA conference I've missed. So thank you for the guilt trip, Tein. Look, in these few minutes, I wanted to dovetail onto Tein's magnificent presentation. And I want to challenge you that we're actually in a new era on the planet, and I call it the COVID pause. We are seeing a reawakening in environmental values, nature, and the way that people are wanting to engage with nature. Native plant nurseries in Western Australia, for example, are doing a booming business. People are rediscovering their backyards, and I see this everywhere around the world. For example, in 2017, the membership of SER, the parent organisation, was languishing at about 1,100 members. We are presently 50 members off 4,000 members. So the COVID pause and putting biodiversity into the planet. And I'm reminded from 2015, I shared a billing with Germaine Greer, and she made this amazing statement that the resilience in what we do is in the mosaic, it's in the biodiversity. Now, overnight, I slipped these two slides in because Professor Xingu and his assistant, Dr. Wen Wei, I asked them for some comments on China's perspectives, and I was astonished. At the very senior levels of the Chinese administration, they talk about eco-civilization. You can read what they say here. And this is, of course, in 2017, green is gold was one of the great mantras that Xi Jinping put through the People's Congress. And indeed, that's now, in 2017, he made the comment, and gosh, wouldn't we love it if all of our leaders said, cherish our environment as we cherish our own lives. And they're now embarking on their own independent push to restore China over a 15-year time frame. And congratulations to them. So some real inspiration coming from China. Of course, this is also critical. As Tein pointed out, there are important values. We, as mostly sophisticated, educated, detached humans, don't understand the ecosystem services, but the value is colossal on the global scale. The challenge question for us, though, is to build this new restoration agenda, this restoration economy. And I would like to propose that there is a new triple bottom line. It's about livelihoods. It has to be integrated with biodiversity, and it has to serve the planet. And this is where we see all the other values in terms of ecosystem services and particularly carbon. And a few of us came together and came up with the fact that we'd like to see by 2030 a restorative culture that is embedded in all thinking, is a new way of operating that links all aspects. We now know so clearly, particularly through the Global EcoHealth Network, and I encourage you to check that out, the value of natural landscapes and systems, green business and ecological economics. We've already got wonderful speakers at this conference, is booming around the world. And more than ever, I know a number of us are constantly asked in urban landscape planning and design and engineering better ways to protect and enhance the environment. And all of this needs to lead to a restorative culture. But there are some trips along the way. This is the Burrup Peninsula. And when I was up there, looks magnificent, looks nice, clean and green. But in the 1 hour of this plenary, they will have produced 1,100 tonnes of carbon dioxide from their gas train. For Woodside alone, they need to offset 10 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year, which equates to about 1 million hectares. The issue is You can do that by planting a lot of trees. But as we see in the Yang paper from Nature Comms in 2019, although this was done in a grassland system and for the simplicity of experimental design, you can see as you go from 1 to 16 species, you dramatically improve not only the soil carbon concentration, but the complexity of the carbon, but also the resilience of that carbon to future loss. So it is a dynamic and important aspect to include biodiversity in the way we approach it. And that's so critical. Look at my backyard. Many of you have seen that image, the wheat belt devastated. We now have one plant left of the Western underground orchid living on that landscape. We have no areas left. Ethiopia, the last vestiges of some of their great forests sit around religious centres, and we now need to do linking and building those environments. Of course, Aldo Leopold, in talking to Ted Sperry in 1936, came up with probably the first great ecological challenge, go plant a prairie. And what he really meant was it was about the biodiversity. It wasn't just about the grasses for the cows or the buffalo, but it was about all of those species. He succeeded. He used some innovative techniques, not with the proper PPE, but no doubt tried their best. And in 1936, at the same time, Albert Morris, of which one of the awards that's being given on Thursday night is the Albert Morris Award with the Barrier Field Naturalist Club, saw the devastation around Broken Hill, and they set up their own club and they started replanting. And they replant so that 85 years on, we still have an ecosystem resembling native reference ecosystems around that area. Now, in moving forward, and these are from the international standards, the 8 guiding principles of the international standards and our guiding principles in the national standards for Australia are so critical in it. And number 3 is the native reference ecosystem. Tein's spoken to that in the way that that should guide us in striving and using all of our capacity and knowledge to build the biodiversity back into the restoration agenda. And as we move along that restorative continuum, this is the image that many of us have seen. It is about adding species, but it's not just adding species and then finding you can't and leaving it to the local nurseryman or the local practitioner. It will be about taking innovation along on the journey. And this is done by a carbon colleague of mine, Professor Viscara Rossell, and the team in building what we call the carbon restoration economy, is that we can have science-based solutions now that will give us some of the existing knowledge and capacity, but it's a merged and shared journey between us, practitioners, and all of those people that I saw today putting their hands up. But it's about the innovation, and it's a two-way street. It's not just white lab coats, but it is a shared journey and includes an integral interaction with Indigenous landholders. There are great stories. You've heard some of that. Gondwana Link keeps growing. They started off, they had 8,000 hectares, they keep growing. It's a shared mixed funding model, so desperately needed in one of the most damaged and depauperate landscapes that in 200 years we took an enormously rich and diverse system and reduced it to weeds, pest diseases, and a fragmented and dysfunctional landscape. And the science into practice matters in that space. And we saw this back in Brisbane in 2018, and I borrowed this slide. Of course, the restoration wheel is such a powerful tool in going forward. I use it with my Coast Care group, and I'm speaking from just on the coast here in Western Australia, and we have fun with the wheel, sure, but we work, we celebrate it, and they get the imagery and the potency of doing this sort of approach. But the innovation that we need, there are challenges. And I want to just to conclude with something that we'll hear a lot more about. There's a great session on seeds and improving supply chains. And supply chains in all aspects of the restoration economy will be important to deliver that biodiversity promise. If we look at the UN decade, and if we look at the land degradation neutral objective of the sustainability goals, They want 144 million hectares within the next 10 years. We've worked out that's about 2.1 million tonnes of seed. How will we do that? Certainly in Australia, we fall well short. And in building that capacity, just last year, in August, we published through SCR the first international principles and standards for native seeds in ecological restoration. This is a document that guides the way you think, plan, and purchase your seed, but it encourages the use of seed farming and innovative techniques and technology. For example, even in our own research group, and I thank Simon Pedrini, who's presenting on this, we've used that to develop our own robust native seed supply database, from testing seed quality, optimizing the seed processing technique, all the way through to improving each seed. So making every seed a winner in restoration, not every 1 in 100 seeds a winner in restoration. And of course, around the world, we see enormous strides being made. This is one of 20 production farms in the US, which I toured, specifically to do prairie and woodland restoration systems. In Kuwait, enormous plantings for production of seeds to restore the desert areas. You can see there's seed banks on the right, and they're ramping up to the multi-million tonnes of seed, or real grassroots Indigenous community development. This is Danilo Azevedo's program that he helped develop in Brazil for the local Xingu people, where they are now involved in repatriating depleted cattle ranching lands, building robust economies, connecting people back to country. In Australia, we've begun the journey. We're seeing that journey commencing through the top end. This is our first attempt in the biodiverse Southwest to work with the Yamaji people of the Southwest to develop the first native seed farm. But we're not stopping there. This is some of the innovative seed technologies that we're trying to train, and hopefully we'll train with a new program with Indigenous communities on how they can develop their very own seed pelleting and production systems. So it's not just the production of seed, but it's making that seed smarter. It's also about smarter seed deployment. These are some of our research programs that we were doing with Kings Park in the Middle East. We need to move and improve the way that we precision seed and enhance the recovery so that the bottlenecks in restoration can be overcome. So the green is gold vision, the Xi Jinping vision. We need to think in the millions of hectares. There is a philanthropist in Western Australia who has now set through his private philanthropy arm the goal of 1 million hectares over the next 10 years. It's bold, it's ambitious, and it needs to be biodiverse. And I think they're going to do their best. It's about local solutions, local engagement, and Indigenous participation wherever we are. It's also about finding the champions. Many of you in the room are the people that hold the secrets to the future and the drive that we need in the restoration economy. And whatever we do, the clock is ticking. It needs to be fast-track and outcome-based science. We don't have the time for decadal, careful thinking. We need to proceed, use adaptive management. And if we do this, we will build a social fabric and a restoration economy that will service the future of people in Australia, overseas, and within our region. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic, Kingsley. Thank you so much. You never fail to deliver. It's very inspiring. That's great. Peter, how are we going for time, and what's the next session? Billy? Okay, excellent. And I'd like just to make a small comment that I don't, one of the reasons why we do emphasise approaches and we ask people to watch the approaches they might use is because ecological restoration does depend upon site assessment to see what level of resilience is in a site. And Kingsley's absolutely right that there are tens of thousands of hectares everywhere in every region that do need revegetation using seed. But it's also the case that there are some landscapes, it's not just small scale sites, where natural regeneration and assisted regeneration can be a pathway for recovery. And this is what the standards are asking us all to look at. And the reason I emphasise this now is because the Albert Morris Award has done just that. It's assessed, the Albert Morris project at Broken Hill, which is the regeneration reserves, assessed that the 1 kilometre wide band around the town that was a town common, and it was overgrazed by everything but buffalo. It had camels, sheep, goats, horses and cows on it. And it was absolutely denuded, really, but it retained its topsoil. And an amateur botanist that Albert Morris was, he was a mines essayer, but in his passion in his private life was botany. And he understood the desert vegetation, and he understood that deserts have an amazing capacity to recover after dry periods and also other impacts if the soil seed bank is still somewhat intact. And he argued to the mining companies and people around the Broken Hill area, other stakeholders, that fencing may be all that is required. They trusted him, it rained, recovery was amazing. The planting that was undertaken there was more for amenity landscaping around the town. That whole regeneration reserve, as it's called, utilised natural regeneration. So in South America, we've also got massive areas that are being regenerated rather than planted. Planting has an incredible place in concert with natural regeneration. We're asking you to look at that. So sorry my comment took so long, but that's an important one for us to take home. Questions from the floor to Kingsley?
And
Yes.
Tein.
So just could you state your name? Sorry, you don't.
Hi, thanks Tein and Kingsley. Alistair Jones, I currently work at Corporate Carbon. My question is around the soil seed banks. Do you guys, have you thought about, I guess, standardised ways to assess soil seed banks? Because I think for me in the past, it's been kind of, you go out and you do an assessment, but a lot of time it's your best guess as to whether there's a decent soil seed bank. And I'm just wondering if there's been thought put into, is there any analytical tools or techniques that we could use that are standardised to actually assess a soil seed bank's viability?
I'd like to direct that to Kingsley, but just beforehand, there are on-site indicators for intact soil seed banks. But Kingsley will talk about perhaps some of the tools for investigating soil seed banks.
That's a fantastic question. So let's talk about putting up an ARC linkage to develop the standards for assessing the soil seed bank. It's one of the biggest vexed issues. I've worked on exactly this aspect for probably 35 years. We thought originally we could do direct assays, that is take soil cores, standard soil cores, and we got a fabulous machine we paid a lot of money for, which was subsequently returned, that had differential gravity separation of soil from seeds, and we couldn't do it, even though we had sent to the manufacturer soil samples where we had salted 20 species with known quantities, and they then partitioned the seed out. They admitted that they actually did a little bit of microscope work with a forceps to pull the seeds out, which was not the process. So there's no magic way of currently assessing directly, except very laborious mechanical methods, and the sampling numbers mean that is never going to be financial. However, as Tein said, it's really looking at your landscapes and understanding your ecosystem. We know, for example, in many temperate regions of Australia, if you've got a decade of degradation, your residual seed bank is probably highly depleted, and if it is there, potentially biased to physically dormant species, which means you'll probably get a lot more legumes than you would want. So it may need some careful assistance. A tool that we've developed, we published on it, of course, for those where these are fire-based systems, and we've done this throughout the desert regions and the arid tropics and the temperate regions, is of course the direct smoking of sites and stimulating the soil seed bank. That works particularly well, but we got in that study really quite depressing outcomes for many post-agricultural landscapes, particularly in the southwest, where there was almost no residual seed bank of any note. However, we were able to use the tool to stimulate certain rare species that had vanished from a site, but we had the pinpoint locations. So I'd be really keen to talk to you and others about the next journey, which is trying to get predictive tools and assessment tools for assessing what residual seed bank is there, understanding the species, and then understanding what immediate remediation, seeding or planting needs to be done.
Thank you. That's a really good question. Any other questions?
Thanks. David Carr here. Given the booming global population and the ambitious targets to plan to restore millions of hectares of ecosystems, it's encouraging to see the continuum there in those standards of recognising that we can't restore everything to original conditions. I just wonder if Tein or Kingsley had some ideas about how we balance those two continuing to compete land uses.
Is land use an important term there, or?
Food production versus
Yes.
ecosystem restoration.
Well, I guess I'll have a go. There is a very big movement at this point in time in regenerative agriculture, and in some cases it's been generically referred to as restorative agriculture, because regenerative agriculture is a bit of a method. I think that's a midpoint example of where you can integrate ecosystem services and potentially native species. Then certainly microorganisms and so on are going to be native species, but there is, as you know, a kind of a whole lot of fingers that extend from bushland areas and native vegetation communities into the utilised landscape, and it would be great to see more of that extension so that we get areas that are perhaps not fully recovered, but they're partially recovered, and they can perform functions of for islands and corridors for the movement of biodiversity across the landscape. So without that integrating, that interaction between utilised landscape and conservation lands, we won't be able to conserve species that need larger ranges. Kingsley, do you have a comment?
Yeah, look, I'll just say the era of Bolsonaro in Brazil has really put some of the incredible restoration optimism on the back burner, but it will return. But when I look at the Xingu program and the way that that's now moved through the Amazon basin, you can integrate production landscapes, you can get better soils, you can have that harmony, as Xi Jinping said, that is build a new deal between economic development and ecological environments. So regenerative agriculture is not going to go away. And one by one state agricultural ministers in Australia, and I know in New Zealand, are already embracing it. Clean, green, healthy food is what people want and demand, and ecological restoration builds the part of the journey in terms of everything from sustainable pollinators sitting around farms to improving water penetration, soil stability, overcoming erosion systems. So lots of people that I've been speaking to in the carbon economy see this integration of the carbon economy, biodiversity and production landscapes as now being the shared journey.
And really where they overlap too, thank you, Kingsley, is in the riparian zones, the streams and rivers, because these are receiving the runoff from the agricultural landscape. And this is what's going to, you know, it's our entire freshwater aquatic ecosystems are dependent upon that improved production and reduced impacts. So I think with that, we'll close this particular talk, and Peter will take over and announce the next part of the morning's session. Thank you.